So did anyone here do any bread baking during the last year, especially when we were all isolated at home? I think lots of people either enjoyed the process of making bread or learned some brand new bread making skills in 2020. So much so that there was a time, if you remember, where there was a shortage of flour at the stores. My oldest daughter got really into making sourdough bread last year. And it was really interesting to hear her explain how the sourdough starter worked and watching her tend it. It was a much different and more meticulous process than making the communion bread that we had been baking here pre-pandemic. And even that had an art to it. You bake it too long and it was crumbly and it created kind of like chunky soup in the chalice. And if you underbaked it too much, it was really gooey. There was a nice sweet spot though that you could find, and when you did, man, it was delicious. And I don't know about you, but I really miss that real bread for communion. It was a better symbol all around in that it was prepared by us. It was baked by us. And we all shared one loaf. And to eat it was to understand a little bit better, I think, what the Bible means when it says, taste and see that the Lord is good. If you like baking bread, if you like eating bread, and especially if you just like thinking about bread, well, you are in luck for the next month. In this liturgical year, the focus is on the Gospel of Mark. The only problem is that the Gospel of Mark is the shortest gospel. So the lectionary, our schedule of readings, has to steal from the Gospel of John to get us back around to another Advent when we start a new focus. And one way the lectionary does this is to give us the entirety of John 6, known as the Bread of Life Discourse, during this summer. It is the bane of all preachers who have to deal with a bread metaphor week after week. Now this week, though, we get a little less talk and a lot more action. The following weeks, we get Jesus' comments on the action, because that's how the Gospel of John works. Jesus will offer a sign, and then he will unpack the sign in great detail for a long time. Hence, we get to think a lot about bread for a period. So if you are into that, here we go. And along the way, I promise that you will encounter some surprises. There are surprises in this morning's reading. You might think I mean the surprise that only 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish were able to feed 5,000 people. I mean, I'm not very good at math, but the fact that Jesus makes that compute is surprising. That kid had some really special sourdough starter. We need to find out about that. You might also think that I mean the surprise that Jesus walks on water. Now, I'm a smart enough person to understand that my spouse at all times walks on water. But other than her, it is surprising that Jesus can do that. So yeah, those things, miracles, if you want to use that term, or signs, as John the evangelist prefers, those things are surprising. But really for me, there's something I think is even more surprising than that. For me, what is truly surprising about the work of Jesus, the work of God, especially in these stories, is that God's work happens through the commonplace. God's work happens through what are otherwise very ordinary circumstances and ordinary things. A meal, bread, a few fish, out on the water in a boat. Not through atypical, extraordinary places or things that you don't know, but through the everyday stuff, through the people around you. See, I don't think it's so much about the multiplying or the water walking, but about the context in which those encounters with the divine occur. You might remember that old country song, Looking for Love in All the Wrong Places. We look for God's activity to come from somewhere wildly outside of our own experience or context. No, and that's what can make it easy to miss. It's in the bread shared at a meal with friends and family. It's in a boat ride in the marsh where the fish are jumping. Last weekend, I went with a group of volunteers down to Buras to meet the people from the Coalition to Restore Coastal Louisiana. It's because of them that surprisingly, 2 years ago, we discovered we owned land in that area. We lost so many records in Katrina that we kind of lost track of the land. And they called us up out of nowhere and told us about what's known as the lemon tree site that we own. It's important to the fishermen down there. It is an important geographical marker for them out on the water. It's even more important to the Grand Bayou Native American community because the lemon trees are the site of an ancient, and I mean ancient, like older than the Bible itself, ancient, sacred mound. The lemon trees there are washing away, like so much of our coastal region. And surprise, we have an opportunity to be a part of this. As we got out of the boat and stepped onto that land, and as I thought about Miss Rosina, the tribal elder, describing how her people see that land and those lemon trees as a gift from the Creator, I couldn't help but have an experience of the divine. To watch members of our church and my own daughter wade in the water and lay down oyster shells. Shells that came from many joyous meals shared by friends and families at restaurants all around this city. What else could I call it but a sign? Shells, water, a marsh, a boat, people, a sign, a miracle, God's work. I may as well have been on a bed of green grass by the Galilee Sea receiving food from an itinerant preacher. What a surprise. Sometimes we limit ideas about what we think miracles are and about where and how God operates. Not by refusing to make room for the extraordinary, but rather failing to notice God working right there within our own lives. What if we started to recognize that this is what the gospel stories are trying to get across all the time? That God's activity happens in every place, at every moment, meaning that anything, any place, any person can and is a vehicle or vessel of the divine presence. Which is partly the whole point of the Jesus story. God incarnate in a typical human life by God's initiative, not ours. What if we started to see that God's work getting done does not require our initiative or even our knowledge that it is happening? See, we think as people of faith that we have to go out and do God's work. And as Paul would say, by no means. God is already working. Our job is to get with the program that is already underway. It's when we recognize that God is always working and is inviting us into the work that we stop trying to look for ways to do God's work and instead learn to recognize where and how God is already working and just respond. When you do that, I promise that you will begin to see miracles all the time. As Elizabeth Barrett Browning said, earth is crammed with heaven, and every common bush afire with God, and only he who sees takes off his shoes. The rest sit round it and pluck back blackberries. As humanity's struggles with this pandemic begin to accelerate again, I've been asking, I think a lot of people have been asking, where is God? Well, where are we looking? And what are we looking for? A major component of God's work in this world is the work of healing. Think of all the healing stories in the Gospels. Think of what the Bible says about the death and resurrection of Jesus, destroying death and making all things new. About what Scripture says about a coming new creation. About our hope that Christ will come again and will complete the healing of creation already begun in the resurrection. Healing of people, of relationships, of our broken world. That is what God is about. So wherever you find healing, whether people think of it like this or not, it is God's work. And it happens through practical means and everyday human beings. Where else would we look to find it? Now, I'm reminded of a story that I know you've probably heard before. I think it's become kind of a mandatory sermon story across Christianity, of the man on his roof after Katrina. Remember this one? During Katrina, there's a man trapped on his roof. As the waters steadily rise, he prays for God to save him. And he's a man of strong faith, so he is confident that God will do just that. And after a while, a boat comes along. "Come on," the woman in the boat says. "Get in." "Nope, it's okay. Go save someone else. God will save me." So the woman moves on. The water's still coming up, and it's higher now. A few hours later, another boat. Same scene. "Nope, it's okay. Go on. God's got me. God's going to save me." Hours go by. And here comes a helicopter. Now the water is so high, there's just this little spot on the roof for the man to stand on his feet. And they throw down a rope ladder, and "Nope, it's okay," the man yells out. "God will save me." So the chopper leaves him. The water's overwhelming. He drowns. In heaven, he rails at God. "I trusted you. You said you would save me." And God looks at the man and says, "I sent you 2 boats and a helicopter. What more did you want?" Now, I usually laugh at that story. But these days, I don't really find it funny. I just find it sad. Because right before us is a boat, a vaccine, a miracle of modern medicine, a sign of God's healing activity in the world. And too many of us stand on the roof because we are waiting for what? A hand to reach down from the clouds and swipe the virus away? That is not how God works. God works through people. God works through medicine. God works through bread, through fish, through boat rides, and through your primary health care provider. To believe otherwise is a kind of blasphemy. Now, I know many people in our congregation are already vaccinated, so I might be preaching to the choir a little bit. But I also certainly understand that there are some cases where a doctor would advise you against having the vaccine for a particular reason. My advice now and always is listen to your doctor and know that for the vast majority of people, this vaccine is safe and effective. And if you have friends or family who are unvaccinated and are listening to misinformation, do all that you can, lovingly, to assure them and encourage them to listen to the advice and guidance of healthcare professionals. If they are people of faith, remind them that, as I saw someone write just this morning, Christians must be open to truth from any source. If you can guide one person to health and healing, then guess what, my friend? You have performed a miracle. You have become a sign of God at work. Anytime you help lead someone to healing and new life, well, what a surprise to discover that you have been an instrument for administering the bread of life.